In 2014, over Southeast Asia and the vast Indian Ocean, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 vanished from the sky. It was a modern Boeing 777 carrying 239 people, operating on one of the world's busiest and most familiar international air routes. The aircraft departed from Kuala Lumpur bound for Beijing. All initial communications were completely normal, with no signs of technical failure or unusual weather conditions. Then MH370 lost contact. The plane deviated from its planned flight path, and onboard communication systems were switched off one by one in a manner that could not be simply explained as an accidental malfunction. The largest search operation in the history of aviation was launched, covering thousands of square kilometers of open ocean. In the end, only a few pieces of drifting debris were found, and not enough to determine exactly what happened to the aircraft or everyone on board. A plane from the age of advanced technology, with radar, satellites, and global navigation systems, disappeared in a way eerily similar to flights from a century ago, when humanity was almost blind before the vastness of the ocean. And most unsettling of all, MH370 was not the first time humanity witnessed a flight vanish without an explanation. In 1937, over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, legendary aviator Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan vanished during a historic flight. They were not unknown figures, but global icons of early aviation, people who were drawing remarkably close to completing a flight around the world. Their aircraft departed from Papua New Guinea, heading toward Howland Island, a tiny destination in the middle of the ocean that had been carefully calculated in the flight plan. At first, everything unfolded exactly as expected, with no sign that a disaster was about to occur. Then the radio communication began to weaken. The final messages became fragmented and difficult to hear, and then fell completely silent. The United States Navy quickly launched a large-scale search operation across the Pacific, and deploying numerous ships and aircraft over many consecutive days. But the final result was still zero: no aircraft wreckage, no human remains, and no evidence sufficient to bring the story to a close. An aviation legend disappeared into the ocean, leaving behind a void that has stretched across decades without a single definitive explanation. And if you think that was the hardest mystery to believe, remember this: later disappearances would involve not just one aircraft or one person, but entire groups vanishing in the very same moment. In 1945, over the Atlantic Ocean, an almost unbelievable event occurred involving the United States Navy, later known as Flight 19. It was a formation of 5 TBM Avenger training aircraft, carrying out a completely routine navigation exercise, flown by well-trained pilots. The flight departed exactly as planned. The weather showed no signs of extreme conditions, and no one believed this would be a particularly dangerous mission. Everything unfolded just like hundreds of training flights before it. Then the turning point appeared. The lead pilot began reporting that the compasses were not working, directions were confused, and the formation could no longer determine its position over the ocean. The radio messages that followed grew increasingly anxious until the entire formation lost contact completely. The U.S. Navy immediately launched a search, and a PBM seaplane was dispatched to assist. But something even more unsettling happened. That seaplane also vanished during the search, leaving no signal and no wreckage behind. In total, 27 people disappeared into the ocean, in an incident that still has no definitive explanation today. Flight 19 became the foundation of a name that would haunt the world for decades: the Bermuda Triangle. And what is truly frightening is that Bermuda never seemed to stop there. In 1948, over the North Atlantic Ocean near the Bermuda region, a civilian aircraft known as Star Tiger disappeared. It was an Avro Tudor 4, operating on an international route, and it was neither a risky journey nor an experimental flight. Star Tiger departed from the Azores, heading toward Bermuda, a familiar crossing for transatlantic flights of that era. Throughout the journey, communication between the aircraft and the ground remained normal, with no technical warnings and no reports of dangerous weather. What makes the case truly chilling lies in the final message. The crew reported that everything was completely stable, with no indication that they were in any danger. And then, Star Tiger vanished. There was no distress signal, no drifting debris, and no wreckage or trace of the aircraft ever found at sea. And the search continued for many days but ended in deadlock, as the ocean returned not a single piece of evidence sufficient to explain what had happened. After this incident, the name Bermuda was no longer just a point on the map. It began to be seriously suspected as a region where something was profoundly abnormal. But the story of aircraft disappearing there was far from over. In 1949, near the Bermuda region, another aircraft disappeared, this one known as Star Ariel. It was the second Avro Tudor IV to vanish in the same stretch of ocean, just 1 year after the Star Tiger incident. Star Ariel was flying from Bermuda to Jamaica, a route considered familiar and not especially dangerous. During the early stage of the flight, everything proceeded normally with no reports of technical problems or unusual weather. Then, without warning, communication was cut off. There was no distress message, no emergency signal, and no explanation at all. A search operation was launched across a vast area of ocean, but the outcome was the same as before. No debris was found, no wreckage was recovered, and no evidence emerged that could explain the disappearance. Two aircraft of the same type, in the same region, and meeting the same fate, made it impossible to continue treating these events as isolated accidents. And what is important to remember is that disappearances like these did not occur only in Bermuda. In 1938, in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, Pan Am Flight 229, also known as the Hawaii Clipper, disappeared. It was a large Martin M130 flying boat, an aircraft designed to land on water and operate long-distance transoceanic flights. The aircraft departed from Guam, beginning a journey across an immense stretch of ocean with almost no visual reference points. In the early phase of the flight, communication was maintained, and there were no serious signs of trouble. Then the crew reported bad weather. After that message, all contact was lost and was never re-established. A large-scale search operation was launched across the Pacific, but the results were completely empty. No wreckage was found, no debris was recovered, and no evidence emerged that could confirm what had happened. The Pacific Ocean is vast, deep, and silent enough to swallow an entire aircraft without leaving a single trace. And if you think only tropical waters are dangerous, the frozen regions to the north hold stories that are even more chilling. In 1951, in the frozen region of Alaska, Canadian Pacific Flight 3505 disappeared. It was a Douglas DC-4 carrying 37 people on a long transoceanic journey from North America to Asia. The flight departed from Vancouver, bound for Tokyo, crossing airspace known for extreme conditions such as snow, strong winds, and dangerous mountainous terrain. In the early stage of the journey, everything proceeded according to plan. There were no technical warnings, no distress signals, and no indication that a disaster was imminent. Then, as the aircraft entered the high mountains and icy regions of Alaska, it suddenly lost contact. From that moment on, no further information was ever transmitted. Search operations were carried out for many years, both by air and on the ground, but all efforts ended in failure. No wreckage was found, no debris was recovered, and no clues emerged that could lead to a conclusion. Sometimes nature does not need storms or explosions. It only needs time and cold to erase steel and engines alike. And if Alaska was enough to leave humanity powerless, the North Atlantic holds mysteries that have shaken the history of aviation even more deeply. The disappearance of the Skyways Avro York in 1953, remains one of the most puzzling cases in the skies over the North Atlantic. The aircraft, an Avro York with registration G-AHFA, was operating at a time when civilian aviation was becoming increasingly busy after World War II. This was not a remote or rarely used route, but one of the most heavily traveled air corridors of that era. The flight departed from the United Kingdom bound for Jamaica, following a carefully planned route. In the early stage of the journey, everything appeared normal, and no signs of trouble were reported by the crew. What makes the incident so unsettling is that the aircraft vanished completely over the Atlantic without sending a single distress signal. There was no emergency message, no mayday call, and no technical warning transmitted to the ground. It was as if the plane simply dissolved in mid-air. Extensive search operations were later conducted across a wide area, but the results were nothing but zero. No debris, no wreckage, and no evidence indicating where the aircraft went down or what caused it to disappear. The Atlantic Ocean kept the entire truth to itself. The Skyways Avro York case left behind a chilling reminder that busy skies do not guarantee absolute safety. And soon after, humanity would face even greater mysteries involving flights that carried not only passengers, but entire military forces into the unknown. Flying Tiger Line. Flight 739 in 1962 is considered one of the most shocking disappearances in the skies over the Western Pacific. On board were 96 U.S. soldiers on active duty at a time when Cold War tensions were running high. This was not a routine civilian flight, but part of a tightly controlled military transport operation. The aircraft departed from Guam and was scheduled to land in the Philippines. After refueling as planned, all initial communications remained stable, and no abnormalities were reported from the cockpit. The turning point came when the aircraft vanished completely from air traffic control screens shortly after the refueling phase. There was no distress signal, no technical warning, and no emergency message. All contact was abruptly cut off, as if the flight had never existed. What makes the case especially chilling is that multiple witnesses on land and at sea later reported seeing a large flash of light and what appeared to be an explosion in the sky at the exact time the aircraft lost contact. However, these accounts remained only eyewitness testimony. Large-scale search operations were launched across the Western Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of ocean were thoroughly searched. The final result was still zero. No debris, no bodies, no fuel traces, and no physical evidence of an explosion that should have left clear signs. Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 became a terrifying paradox. An explosion seen by many, yet with no crash site to prove it ever happened. And it was not only the Pacific Ocean. Asia, too, has recorded similar aviation mysteries that remain unresolved to this day. The disappearance of an Indian Air Force Antonov. An-32 in 1986 remains one of the most perplexing military aviation mysteries in peacetime. The An-32 was a military transport aircraft, highly regarded for its durability and its ability to operate in harsh conditions. The flight took place in 1986 over the Arabian Sea during a routine training mission. There was no special cargo, no combat situation, and no security warnings issued beforehand. Everything changed when the aircraft was flying over the sea and suddenly lost all contact with air traffic control. There was no distress signal, no technical fault report, and no abnormal information recorded from the cockpit. A large-scale search and rescue operation was launched, involving the Navy, the Air Force, and patrol vessels over several consecutive days. However, the final result was still zero. No debris, no oil slick, and no sign that the aircraft had ever crashed into the sea. The Indian Air Force Antonov. An-32 case leaves behind a cold reality. Even the military, with strict control systems and modern technology, does not always have answers. And when aircraft fly into remote and rugged mountainous regions, the mystery becomes even harder to unravel.